Hello, welcome back to my channel. Now last week I did a video outlining what I think are the 10 most underrated films of all time. And these were all films that appear in my own personal top 100 and films that I hadn't discussed before on this channel. And it seemed to go down quite well, and I asked people if they were interested in a secondary list because there were loads of films I could have picked from my top 100 list. So this is a follow-up video outlining 10 more films, all of which appear in my top 100 list, which you can find below in the link, and all of which I've not discussed on this channel before, and all of which I think are brilliant movies, some of the best movies I've ever seen, movies that have touched me and fascinated me, but never seem to find their way to the top of these polls. The first one I want to pick from the BFI Flipside series, I don't know if you've followed this series, it's a Blu-ray series of oddball British films that have disappeared into the cracks. I've loved this film for such a long time. It was made by the great Polish filmmaker Jerzy Skolimowski, who's recently kind of come back from the dead with his film about a donkey called Io. But Skolimowski followed Polanski out of Poland in the 1960s. And Polanski stopped in England for a bit and then went to America, but Skolimowski seemed to stay in Britain. And he made three beautiful films in Britain. One is The Shout, starring John Hurt and Alan Bates. Another is Moonlighting, starring a very young Jeremy Irons. But possibly my favourite is this one that he made in 1970 with Jane Asher, who was going out with Paul McCartney at the time, I think. This is a great little movie. It's really a rites of passage about a young teenage boy falling in love for the first time. He works at this local swimming baths, where Jane Asher is also an attendant. Most of the swimming pool scenes actually were filmed in Germany, weirdly enough. And it's just about how he falls in love with Jane Asher and he becomes kind of obsessed with her, and how eventually this obsession turns tragic. It's a beautiful little movie. It's very funny. It has a great scene where Diana Dawes pulls him into her cubicle and proceeds to have an orgasm while thinking about George Best scoring a goal. One of the great scenes of 60s, 70s British cinema. Very funny. And it's a light drama, but it's got a sting. Like so much of Skolimowski's films, it's got a sting, a real poignancy. And I'm extremely fond of it. Skolimowski is a very unusual director. I've always felt, even before EO came along, Skolimowski is one of the great underrated directors of world cinema. And he has a way of bringing you into a sort of light drama. And then the way he directs, often he has hands appearing from the side. You just see a little hand doing some painting, then the hand will disappear again. That is kind of the way he makes his films, like little things come in at the side, little things that suggest paranoia or a different way of seeing what you're looking at. And it makes a very involving, slightly disconcerting kind of cinema. Try it out. It's great fun, and it's got music by Cat Stevens. Another movie that is great fun but is also slightly disconcerting is Valerie and Her Week of Wonders by Marguerite Duras, a Czech director. Now, in the 1980s, one of my favourite films as a teenager was The Company of Wolves by Neil Jordan. And this is based on the stories of Angela Carter, and it's about a young girl. It's a rites of passage for a young girl growing up in this kind of medieval English village, and then she comes across a werewolf, but she falls in love with the werewolf. So it's kind of one of these fantasy Red Riding Hood stories of a girl coming to terms with her sexuality. And I thought it was incredibly original and brilliant and bold. But then later on I discovered this, and I realised that Neil Jordan had an antecedent, let's put it that way. This is an incredible film. If you like the genre of fairy tale, if you like the genre of fantasy and this kind of thing, you will love this movie. It is an extraordinary film. I notice on the back of this particular copy, they don't outline the plot, because no outline of the plot will ever give you a sense of what this film is like to watch. It's like a sort of fever dream of erotic and potent imagery where this girl is kind of chased by death stroke the devil, and she wins. It's an extraordinary film, highly recommended if you love the fairy tale genre. This, I think, is probably the acme of that genre. Now, talking of rites of passage for young children, a very interesting film that I've only ever been able to see once, and I I've not been able to locate it on DVD in Britain or in the West anywhere, is a Japanese film called Moving by a director called Shinji Sōmai, who's something of a cult figure in Japan, but is not very well known in the West. There is one of his films available in Britain. It's got a wonderful name, Machine Guns and Sailor Suits, where this young 13-year-old girl becomes a Yakuza chief. It's great fun, check it out. But Moving is an absolute masterpiece. It's about a young 12-year-old girl and her parents are getting divorced. And that really is it. It's seeing this kind of rather acrimonious divorce from the point of view of a young sort of teenager. But what Shinji Sōmai does, and what I admire so much about the film, is that he raises this simple trauma of an ordinary person into a mythic level. And there's a beautiful sequence about two-thirds of the way through the film where she goes to this festival in Japan, this kind of fireworks festival. And she's wandering through it on her own at night, and there's all these men throwing around, bales on fire and fireworks going off. And it's like she goes to this dark night of the soul, and it's all done in representational terms, but filmed beautifully and realistically. It's like no other film I've ever seen. It's one of the best films I've ever seen about children or teenagers coming to terms with the realities of adult life. And it doesn't stint on the adult life at all. The nature of the divorce is seen quite graphically. There are scenes of violence and scenes of real arguing and distress. It's a great movie. If you can get hold of it, please do watch it. And if there's any distributor out there, please release it on DVD. I want to stay in Japan for the next few choices because I'm a great fan of Japanese cinema. And I'd like to introduce you to this film, A Scene at the Sea by Takeshi Kitano. Takeshi Kitano was a huge figure in the 90s. He was one of my favourite directors in the 90s. He seemed something so new. This Japanese comedian stroke TV presenter turned filmmaker. And he made these really sort of offbeat gangster films, very sort of, jaggedly directed gangster films that had bits of sort of goofy male frat boy comedy mixed with real sort of nihilistic violence. Now, in the middle of it all, he made this film. This was his third film, and it's not very well known. Why was this film so important to me, and why is it part of my top 100 list? Let me explain. When I was younger and a bit pretentious, a bit wanky, I had an idea that what I wanted to see more than anything, or make perhaps, was a kind of cinema where nothing happens, right? There's no real narrative incident. There's not much characterization. And yet, in watching it, just in the way that the director uses composition and colour and editing and music, you feel everything. That anyone watching it could feel it was about them and the experiences they'd been through. It's a kind of, anti-masterpiece cinema, where there's no particular element you could single out, but the whole thing becomes something very beautiful and moving, like a poem. What I didn't realise at the time was that these films were already being made. Certain directors were already moving towards it. Later on, you get a whole genre that was nicknamed slow cinema. I detest that phrase. But it's that kind of thing where nothing really appears to be happening, but if you're watching it attentively, so much is happening, right? So Takeshi Kitano, I saw this film and I thought, oh my God, someone has already done this, right? Now this is a film, it's about a deaf and dumb lad, and he wants to learn how to surf. That's it. And we watch him go for lessons, and we watch him take part in a tournament, and he gets a girlfriend. End of the film. That's it. And yet it is moving and beautiful. Tony Raines, who's a very perceptive critic, I think, said it's the best editing since Bresson. And I think he's right. Staying in Japan, now this is a very little known film, and I caught it at a festival of Japanese cinema in London about 2 years ago. The film actually broke in the gate while we were watching it, and we all stood outside the fire exit, a little clump of us, desperately wanted to go back in to see the end of the movie because it was so good. It's a film called The Long Darkness by Kei Kumei, a director I previously wasn't familiar with at all. It was made in the 70s in black and white, and it's a very simple film. It's simply about two people meeting cute in a cafe a student, and this girl who's a waitress in the cafe. They fall in love, they get married despite some complications, and they learn to love each other and live together. That's it. There's no sort of, modern day issue drama. There's no problematic, there's no shades, there's no discussion of trauma or persecution or anything like that. It's just two people meeting, falling in love, getting married, meeting the in-laws, and falling in love. And that's one of the reasons I like it. It shows that that kind of film can be made. And this was made right in the teeth of the sort of counterculture of the 60s and 70s. What apparently is a very conservative film, just showing the sort of the natural order, the sort of meeting, getting married, etc. The very conservative idea of how a couple acts together. But showing that with all the techniques of modern cinema, and showing it with great compassion and integrity and intelligence, and extremely moving, and showing that it's as true as any counterculture argument or any discussion of people who don't fit into that, that system, if you like. And that's one of the reasons I really deeply admired it. It's a very brave film, and it's a very beautiful film, and it shows the truth of just people falling in love and interacting with each other. It doesn't have to be about conflict. It doesn't have to be about aggression or hostility or making a point. It just shows that this in itself is enough to be called drama. And it's an extremely beautiful and moving film. The filmmaking is peerless throughout. If you get to see it, try it. I know it doesn't sound very interesting. Actually, it's really, really beautiful. The next Japanese film I want to talk about is something very different to that. It couldn't be more different, actually. The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On. Japanese documentary really exploded, both in its quality and in its form, and in its aggression and the way it treated subjects in the 60s and 70s. Perhaps this is the most aggressive form of all. Katsuhara took it right to the limit. Now, what he did was, there was a guy who had been a serving officer in the Japanese army. And this guy had done a one-man campaign, really, saying that some of the Japanese officers at the end of the Second World War had eaten, cannibalized some of their own men. And he was determined to prove it. The filmmaker followed him on his campaign and actually arranged for him to meet some of the previous officers and their families. Now, the guy in question uncomfortably seems almost on the point of being deranged, and he actually starts punching and kicking them to get them to tell the truth. This is documentary right on the edge. Many people will say that it's unethical, that it's wrong, but I think that's what makes it such an interesting film, and a film that any student of documentary should wrestle with this movie. It's an extraordinary film. It's saying, I don't care about ethics and, sort of artistic morals and principles. I just want to get to the truth. And what does that look like? To get to the absolute truth of a situation, something so horrible, something so taboo. These guys, the Japanese army had so few supplies that they started eating their own men. He also, there's two parts to the documentary. He also wants to get them to confess that they executed some men once the armistice had been passed. So these are the two campaigns he's on. But it's an extraordinary film, and it forces you as a viewer to think about your own ethics. Do you think this is right? Do you think this is true? Do you think the truth matters more than the gaining of the truth? Does the end justify the means? Every single person interested in documentary should watch this movie. I quite like extreme cinema. This is pretty extreme. Cockfighter by Monty Hellman, who's a sort of cult American director of the 60s and 70s. I don't know why I like this film so much, because it's about Warren Oates plays this guy, and he makes a living as a cockfighter. They get cockerels to fight each other in little rings, something that's been banned in England for so many years. And he follows Warren Oates on this sort of this cockfighting ring in the south of America. And there's a lot of footage, quite close-up footage of these cockerels fighting each other with these spears, little spikes attached to their legs. So it's pretty gruesome. If you're an animal lover, it's a very tough film to watch. But I am an animal lover, and I have it in my collection. I don't really know how to sell this film. I think it's one of the most extraordinary cult films in American film. Um, Kent Jones, who's a very good critic, said it is the most Rossellinian of American films. I think that gets close to it, that Monty Hellman doesn't treat this subject in any way in a sensationalist manner. Instead, he treats it affectionately and with interest in the human beings involved and who they are and how they've come to be like this. And he takes it in a very strange, surreal direction. Warren Oates' character refuses to speak until he wins the tournament. And it builds to, I think, one of the most extraordinary endings, certainly in American film, but in any film, which I don't really want to spoil too much. But suffice to say, a woman puts the head of a chicken into her handbag and walks away, and Warren Oates grins and says, "She loves me, Al." I have wrestled with that ending for years. I still don't really understand it, but I know that it's one of the great endings. I'll leave you to discover it. Another of my favourite films for the longest time is a film that Criterion are going to release very soon. I think it's been released, actually, I think it's just been released yesterday. It's called India Song by Marguerite Duras. It fascinates me that whenever people are talking about female directors, they never ever mention Marguerite Duras. Yet to me, she's probably the greatest female director we've had. She's more famous, of course, as a novelist. She was part of the Nouveau Roman movement in France in the early 1960s. And she's also probably best known because she was a partner of Jean-Paul Sartre. But Duras was a fascinating figure in her own right. I mean, if you want to have a good read the first 50 pages of her wartime diaries. It's actually about her childhood growing up in French-occupied Indochina. It's extraordinary. And how this Indo-Chinese man, about 30 years her senior, makes a play for her and keeps coming to pick her up from school and have a relationship with her, which became the basis of her famous story and film L'Amant, the Lover. But she was a brilliant novelist, very important novelist in France. But she was also an important filmmaker. I saw a whole article written about Marguerite Duras where they didn't mention once that she was a filmmaker. Yet she's an extraordinary filmmaker. India Song, by anyone's, valuation, is an extraordinary movie. Now, I admit it's not a film for everybody, right? It's a very slow-paced, very opaque art film. And it's set in the world of the French Raj, not the English Raj, but the French colonials in India. And a man, brilliantly played by Michel Lonsdale, one of my favourite actors, has fallen in love with the wife of one of the diplomats. And it's threatening to become a scandal. Now that makes it sound like some kind of, English period costume drama. But in fact, the way that Marguerite Duras does this is very strange. The whole film, almost, is presented through voiceover. You can hear people telling each other the story in voiceover. You almost never get any kind of direct sound or direct dialogue. And most of the time, what the characters are doing is dancing. They are meeting at dances and soirees and just moving around this scenery. Actually, Duras filmed most of it in France, in Paris, but okay. And it's an extraordinary movie. It's got like an almost hypnotic, trance-like feel. It's like you're in this never-ending night, this Indian night, where people are just endlessly dancing and drinking. And underneath the surface, there is this desire and passion bubbling under. It's like a sort of weird opium dream film. I love it to pieces. The music is great. It does take a bit of patience, but if you get under its spell, it's intoxicating. Another great movie, for me, this has just come out on Blu-ray in Britain, is Cutter's Way, also known as Cutter and Bone, I think, in the US. God, I love this film so much. I suppose you could say it's a kind of neo-noir. Jeff Bridges plays this kind of, he's a bit of a bum character. He works in a marina in California. And one night he sees someone dump a body in an alleyway. And his friend, played by John Hurt, who's a Vietnam vet, is convinced that the murderer is a local businessman. And he wants the businessman to be to be the murderer because he's got a real hang-up. The Vietnam War has left him a drunk, it's left him a cripple, and he's angry at the sort of authorities and powers that be that led to him losing his life. And so he decides that this guy is guilty because he wants to. He wants to have a crusade against these people. So it's a kind of weird, surreal noir where is that person really guilty or is this just a creation of this Vietnam vet's mind? And really the film is not really about the murder in a way. It's about the relation between the three main characters, between this John Hurd, this Vietnam vet, Jeff Bridges, his friend, and his wife, brilliantly played by Lisa Eichhorn. An amazing performance, but an actress I'm not familiar with in any other film. What happened to her? Apparently she's interviewed on this Blu-ray. Their performances in this film are absolutely incredible. How all three of them didn't win an Oscar, I don't know. Absolutely incredible. The music by Jack Nietzsche gets the tone of the film just right. He actually composed it. You know those glasses half full of water and you run your finger around the rim and all that? He used that in the score. So it's a score that's weird and haunting and sad, but also it's got a slight touch of silliness, which is exactly how the film is operating. It was directed by Ivan Passer, a Czech director, wonderful Czech director, made a fantastic film in Czechoslovakia in the 60s called Intimate Lighting, which you should definitely check out if you can find it. And also if you can find it, this is very hard to find. He made a very good film in New York in the 70s with George Segal called Born to Win. That's a great movie, but it's been kind of lost. But Cutter's Way is a masterpiece. I'm going to end with a much more traditional movie. You know those kind of classic Hollywood films from the 30s or 40s where some young woman is caught between a good man and a bad man. You know those kind of melodramas. I quite like some of those. My personal favourite is Daisy Kenyon. Now, Daisy Kenyon was made by Otto Preminger. Preminger is a renowned American director from Hollywood who often made quite difficult, prickly movies on big issues, films like Exodus about Israel. He made Bonjour Tristesse with David Niven, a sort of a succès de scandale at the time. He made Laura, which was a famous noir with Dana Andrews. But I prefer this film over all of those, and it's quite hard to say why, but the acting to start with, just like in Cutter's Way, it's a trio of actors, Jane Crawford, Henry Fonda and Dana Andrews, who are absolutely brilliant in their roles. Joan Crawford is an artist designer, so a sort of independent, self-made woman, and she's caught between Dana Andrews, who's a heel, as the Americans say. He's a sort of big-town lawyer who's not got many morals, and Henry Fonda, who's a war vet, who's clearly struggling with his memories. And unlike most of these kind of melodramas, the characterizations are very intelligent, very adult. The way that the characters interact is very adult. There's some brilliant scenes involving Dana Andrews, who I think almost outacts Joan Crawford and Henry Fonda. He takes on this case, a sort of political correctness case, as we would call it now, where he's found out that this Japanese man is being persecuted after the war because he's Japanese. He's being prejudiced against. And he takes it on almost to please Joan Crawford. But in doing so, it starts to affect his conscience and his morality. It's a very good performance by Dana Andrews. And there's a wonderful scene in the film where he and his wife have a very acrimonious split. And at one point, he goes with Joan Crawford to the court to deal with this in the court case. And as he comes out, he actually bursts into tears. And he says, I've realised that my wife is starting to hit our children. Extraordinary scene in a 1940s American film. It's very powerful, brilliantly acted by Andrews and Joan Crawford. And the film is full of those kind of scenes. It eventually hits melodrama at the end. Joan Crawford has some kind of car crash and stumbles back, finds the two men together. You have to have that sort of thing. But for the vast majority of the movie, it's an extremely adult and intelligent film. And I strongly recommend you to give it a try. So those are 10 more films that I think are in the underrated. I could still go on, actually. There's about 5 or 6 other films I could talk about. But these are all in my top 100, which I'll give you a link to below. And let me know other films that you think are really underrated. Thanks very much for watching, and if you like my content, please like and subscribe.